There are historical moments on the front lines of the war between Ukraine and Russia. For a long time, the intensity of clashes was centered in eastern Ukraine. But with the arrival of spring and rising temperatures, both sides of the war began to focus their attention on the south of Ukraine. The reason for this is that the eastern Ukrainian front lines have more operational importance, while the southern fronts are at the center of the strategy. The key strategic center of the war at the moment is the Crimea and southern Ukraine regions. The priority for Crimea is to have full control of the Kherson region and its surroundings. For this purpose, the Ukrainian armed forces recently signed a historic step on the sides of the Dnipro River in the Kherson region. Crossing the Dnipro was crucial to the Ukrainian army's goal of controlling Crimea, which Moscow had annexed 9 years ago. The Russians never considered that the Ukrainians could achieve this, but the situation that the Russians did not expect finally came true. As a result of the efforts of the Ukrainians, Ukrainian troops managed to cross the Dnipro River in the south of the country for the first time since the beginning of the Russian invasion. This breakthrough, following rumors of a partial withdrawal from Russia's Kherson region, shifted the focus of the war in that direction. In addition, the striking success of Ukraine left Russian leader Vladimir Putin helpless, especially in this critical time of the war. On the other hand, since the Russian troops withdrew from Kherson in November, the Dnipro River has been the front line. Analysts speculate that Ukraine's spring offensive could progress from 100 kilometers south of the river, possibly to annex Crimea. According to experts at the Institute for War Studies in the United States, images from Russian military bloggers provided the first reliable geolocated image of Ukrainian positions south of the river. The scope and purpose of these Ukrainian positions highlight the ability of Ukrainian forces to maintain their sustained positions in this area. The Russian-appointed governor of the Kherson region in southern Ukraine denied reports that Ukrainian forces were positioned on the eastern bank of the Dnipro River. Vladimir Saldo stated in a Telegram update that Russian forces have full control over the region, but the proven footage proves the Ukrainian domination of the river. Despite all this, Saldo suggested that the images referenced by the ICW may be of Ukrainian sabotage units who managed to take a selfie along the Dnieper River before being pushed back. In response to the reports in the Ukrainian media that the establishment of certain positions marked the beginning of a counterattack, a critical statement came from the Kiev authorities. Natalia Humeniuk, spokesperson for Ukraine's Southern Operational Command, stated that the details of military operations in the Dnieper Delta could not be disclosed for operational and security reasons. Humeniuk also mentioned on Ukrainian television that crossing a wide and powerful river like the Dnieper is a very difficult task, but the images that emerged indicated that the Ukrainians had succeeded in this challenge. According to the reports of the Institute of War Studies, Ukrainian forces established positions near the town of Oleshki, across the Dnieper Delta from Kherson. Also, according to recent reports, Ukrainian troops are advancing towards the nearby village of Dapchi. It is also claimed that Ukrainian troops held these positions for several weeks and secured supply lines. These statements also showed that there was no Russian control in the region. However, Russian military figures feel that instead of launching new operations due to material and manpower constraints, the Russian military should consolidate its current gains in Ukraine. The head of the Wagner Group, financier Yevgeny Prigozhin, stated that the Russian forces must firmly secure their positions to prevent the opponent from tearing them apart. A 5-minute audio recording was also released, in which Wagner Group financier Yevgeny Prigozhin discusses the upcoming Ukrainian counter-offensive and the crippling shortage of ammunition facing Russian forces in the Donbass. In this recording, Wagner Group head Yevgeny Prigozhin admitted that Russian soldiers died at a rate of 5-to-1 compared to Ukrainians because they were not given bullets or there was no suitable artillery. This stunning 5-minute audio recording, possibly created near Ukraine's Eastern Front, was shared on Telegram channels sympathetic to the Wagner Group cause. Considering Prigozhin's previous complaints against the generals of the Russian armed forces with whom he disagreed for much of the occupation, this scandal is likely to give the Russian administration a headache. In a voice message, Prigozhin stated that the armed forces of Ukraine are fully ready to cut off the Russian military wings. Furthermore, Prigozhin points out that the number of people at Wagner PMC is decreasing. The Wagner leader added that they could hold off for another 2 to 3 weeks until the last bullet is in the magazine, considering that the Russian war generals should take responsibility for what happened on the Wagner front, said Prigozhin. The Ukrainian counterattack is inevitable. On May 2nd, the last rain should fall. Another week is needed for the wind to dry the soil. After that, the armed forces of Ukraine will be ready to act. When the Ukrainians begin to advance, the mobilized Russians will ask, "Where is our ammo? Where is our leadership? Where are our commanders?" Once again, a crime is being committed against the Russian Federation. The claims made by the Wagner leader in this remarkable audio recordings are quite striking. In fact, if we look at the battlefield in Ukraine from a broad perspective, we can clearly see that Prigozhin was right on this issue, because in Wagner's troops, instead of one being killed while attacking a building, 5 people die because there are no bullets. And the Wagner members don't have enough artillery to counter the Ukrainian artillery. Wagner leader made striking statements not only about the front line, but also about the conscientious parties of this war. Prigozhin described the Russian war cabinet as scumbags, noting that the deceased will have to answer to their mothers. Also, since the Wagner Group's attack on Bakhmut that began nearly 10 months ago, Prigozhin has repeatedly provided false information to the Russian blogger community in an attempt to undermine support for Putin's war generals. The Russian Ministry of Defense claims that Prigozhin used the alleged successes of the mercenary unit as leverage in his attempt to gain influence in the Kremlin and his friend Vladimir Putin. Therefore, Prigozhin's words are characterized by officials of the Russian Ministry of Defense as unreliable. The conflict between the Russian administration and the Wagner Group is very useful for the Ukrainian forces. Ukraine's counterattack is expected to take place in the coming weeks or months as the differences of opinion within Russia continue to be fierce. Military experts speculate that the scope of Ukraine's offensive plans may also include an advance towards the occupied city of Melitopol. A successful maneuver of the Ukrainian forces in this direction would block the Russian land bridge from the Crimean Peninsula to the clash areas in Donbass in eastern Ukraine. Also, this critical step will effectively isolate Putin's soldiers from one another. On the other hand, most of the Wagner Group is located in Bakhmut in the Donetsk region of the Donbass. If the Ukrainians broke through the Russian lines to the west, efforts to besiege the city would become nearly impossible. But the Ukrainians chose a much more logical path. In other words, the Ukrainian armed forces have given priority to Crimea, which is described as the most critical center of the war. But the Ukrainians also continue to carry out defensive missions on the eastern front lines. The war in Ukraine has given rise to countless prophecies, quite different predictions and interpretations. The critical steps taken to reshape the world order to restore Europe to its former peaceful days, and the Ukrainians to regain their independence, surpass all these prophecies. Contrary to Russian leader Vladimir Putin's thoughts that the invasion plan would come true in a short time, the Ukrainians did not mislead us and managed to plunge the occupation forces into the swamp of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. The Russian war tanks, infantry and artillery units and the military power of the occupying army, which started to cross the Ukrainian land border, fell into a circle of flames like a hellhole in Donbass. This circle of flame, which especially affected the front lines of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, reached Bakhmut, the fortress of the war. The momentary situation in the city of Bakhmut, the scene of the most violent clashes and hot offensive operations, shows us that the decisive victory of the Ukrainian forces for freedom is very close. The Ukrainian army, which is constantly supported by Western Europe, the Baltic countries, The USA and most of the world's countries in terms of military and financial means has activated countless assassins and special forces in order not to lose the eagle's nest seen as a Lamet castle in the war. With this big move of the Ukrainian army, the clashes in Bakhmut reached a boiling point with the arrival of the Azov Special Forces of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, who had special abilities specialized in assassination and frontline operations and fought for the liberation of Mariupol to Bakhmut. The strategic balance in the city and the advantage in clashes passed into Kiev's hands. Even with the arrival of the Azov Battalion in Kramatorsk, the occupying army began to reinforce its troops in Bakhmut. Why were the Russians so afraid of the Azov Special Forces, even though there was a 55-kilometer distance between the two cities? Or had this special Ukrainian contingent come to completely cleanse Bakhmut of the Russians before the Azov Special Forces reached Bakhmut? The Ukrainian army maintained its dominant advantage in the city, but in Bakhmut, Russian troops were still carrying out offensive operations, carrying out serious actions against battle tanks and other military equipment of the Ukrainian army. With the participation of the Azov forces in clashes operations in Bakhmut, the occupation troops could not easily move on the front lines of the city. Azov warriors, with a huge army of about 3,500 men, crossed Kramatorsk and entered the outskirts of Bakhmut. The Azov Special Forces completely devastated the Russians in Bakhmut after New Year's Eve. Earlier this week, the Azov Special Forces of the Ukrainian Armed Forces suddenly appeared within 7 kilometers of the Russian lines. Elite brigade troops broke through the border, drawn by Russian troops, and neutralized 24 invaders in a covert offensive infiltration operation. The soldiers of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade and the 98th Battalion of the Regional Defense Forces, previously known as Azov Special Operations Forces, accompanied this joint striking operation, which was also part of this brigade. The Artillery Division Command Post drill. News of the extermination of 20 Russian invaders spread to the occupation front lines in the deepest reaches of Donetsk. As a result of the reconnaissance and detection flights of the warplanes of the Ukrainian army in the city, this incredible success of the Azov Special Forces was proven just days after this stunning attack. Azov Special Forces and Ukrainian border guards killed a total of 14 Russian soldiers and injured 14 Russians in another offensive operation in Bakhmut. With these last attacks of the Azov Special Forces that took place in the past days, the intensity of the clashes in the land corridor in Bakhmut began to decrease relatively. The Ukrainian armed forces, on the other hand, wanted to take advantage of this situation and reactivated the ingenious war strategy it had used long ago. The bunkers in Bakhmut were used as an operation center from the first days of the war, where the Ukrainian forces managed the clashes in this region. As we mentioned, after the effective operations of the Azov forces and the tension in the Bakhmut front line decreased a little, the Bakhmut bunkers used by the Ukrainian soldiers started to become active again. The 3rd Separate Assault Brigade is a mechanized assault brigade formed on November 1, 2022, in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The brigade was created from the Azov Special Operations Forces, so in November 2022, and was originally formed by veterans of the Azov Regiment and is considered a full-fledged combat unit of the Ukrainian Armed Forces within the Ukrainian Ground Forces. The formation of the brigade was made to provide a highly mobile, well-armed and well-trained unit that could take part effectively in both defensive and offensive operations. The entire brigade, which currently consists of about 3,500 elite Azov fighters, is deployed in the Bakhmut region, a city in Ukraine's Donetsk Oblast. The brigade was awarded the regimental color on February 24, 2023, by President Vladimir Zelensky at the presentation of colors ceremony. Mind games started to appear in Bakhmut with the reactivation of the power coming from the underground in Bakhmut. Even now, the most competent drone operators in the Ukrainian army control these vehicles from bunkers in Bakhmut. Ukrainian drone operators in the bunkers share strategic details with the Ukrainian forces in the region, such as the critical coordinates, the positions of the occupying troops, and how many Russian soldiers are on the front lines in Bakhmut. With this information reaching the Ukrainian forces, the artillery units of the Ukrainian armed forces were hitting the Russian military ammunition depots, military bases, and assembly centers with pinpoint shots. On the other hand, Azov Special Forces, one of the most elite special units of the Ukrainian army, was contacting the Ukrainian UAV operators in the shelters and hunting the Russians one by one in the trenches. Thanks to this ingenious intelligence and operational tactic, the armed forces of Ukraine retains 90% of the control in Bakhmut, which is now seen as the bastion of the war. This striking advantage of the Ukrainian armed forces in Bakhmut is owed to the arrival of the Azov Special Forces in the city with their huge army. Because if this Ukrainian special unit had not handled the critical situation in Bakhmut and had not brought the Ukrainian army to the fore in ground operations, the Russians could have formed a dominant force in the city. Even today, the special unit of Ukraine continues to take critical steps towards preserving the old peace in the city by fulfilling its mission. Thanks to the Azov Battalion in Bakhmut, which has turned into a 41-kilometer battlefield, the current situation seems to be under control. On the other hand, in Bakhmut, the city was almost devastated due to warm contacts, fierce clashes, and offensive operations between both sides of the war. While the aerial snapshots of Bakhmut reveal the true face of the war, the black smoke that formed in the sky within the city limits still did not disappear. This means that the danger in the city has not yet completely passed. After the successful operations carried out jointly by Azov Special Forces and Ukrainian drone operators, the Russians began serious military preparations to regroup at a distance of about 10 kilometers from Bakhmut. The Russians have recently tried to block the road from Slavyansk to Bakhmut and have captured several villages there and are on their way to the only more or less safe road to the city. This area passes as the corridor where the Ukrainian army still supplies the defenders of Bakhmut. This may actually be a very risky move for Russian troops because the only success of the occupation army in the regions close to the city of Bakhmut is considered to be Sloviansk. If the Azov Special Forces and other Ukrainian military forces hinder these Russian preparations, if the invaders in this region suffer another blow from the Ukrainian army, it will be almost impossible for the Russian forces to regroup and attack Bakhmut again. Considering the recent heavy military casualties of the Russian army in Bakhmut and its environs, this move of the occupying army is almost a suicide attempt. But the Ukrainians seem to have already taken security measures at the Bakhmut borders in the northern borders of Bakhmut. The Ukrainian border guards do not bring the Russians closer to this borderline with their daily critical operations. It is estimated that these unsuccessful attempts of the occupying army and the loss of more than 700 soldiers every day in clashes in Bakhmut will result in the planting of the Ukrainian flag on the highest parts of this fortress. With the complete cleansing of the Russians from Bakhmut, all the balances in the war will probably change. If you ask how the city, which was seen as strategically insignificant in the first few days of the war, has become one of the most key regions, the answer is actually quite simple. Both sides of the war have long focused their military intensity on Bakhmut and its environs. For this reason, Bakhmut began to act as a bridge between both Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Each attack, or a different attempt experienced here, was affecting all regions in Donbass. In order for the Russians to dominate Luhansk, they must take Bakhmut so that they can reach the front lines such as Kupiansk, Kremenna, and Stydhov. But the freedom-loving Ukrainians never seem to lose this city to the invaders. In the coming days, we will be back with hot news from the war. After decreasing the intensity of their attacks around Bakhmut, the Russians seem to have shifted their focus back to southern Ukraine because over the last several days the Russians have been sending here a lot of military equipment. In fact, just yesterday, locals filmed how several convoys with troops and ammunition passed through Melitopol heading in the direction of Berdyansk. However, relocating forces in such big batches comes at a cost. It is very easy to locate and target them, especially given that these convoys go through Tokmak and Melitopol, as both cities are within reach of Ukrainian artillery. The Ukrainians did not miss a chance to strike areas of concentration of troops and ammunition. Today it was reported that there were huge explosions in Tokmak, and local news reported that the Ukrainians struck a base with a newly arrived mobilized man at least 4 times. The attack was conducted at night, so Russian troops were likely gathered together in barracks and sleeping. So the fact that the Ukrainians struck the base 4 times likely means that they managed to identify and target all places which the Russians allocated to them. But this is only one of few attacks that happened on this front line over the last 4 days. Ukrainian artillery is constantly conducting special fire missions with the goal of destroying concentrations of troops and ammunition. Last week, the Ukrainians managed to identify and destroy 2 ammunition depots in the prefrontal settlement of Polog. This put a huge strain on the short-term supplies of ammunition, and Ukrainian intelligence reported that the Russians had to cancel several reconnaissance in-force operations towards Huliipol. What made the situation even worse was that the Ukrainians had also destroyed a command center in Tokmak. As you know, the Russians have a very centralized system of decision-making. So when the hydrogen is taken out, a whole segment of the front line usually freezes. Nonetheless, the fact that the Russians started sending convoys to this region seems to be worrisome. Ukrainian military officials confirmed that Russian forces are trying to increase the concentration of their forces in unspecified location. The head of the local Ukrainian Joint Press Center clarified that the Russian command has not yet chosen a specific operational direction. Russian media sources have been emphasizing recently that the Russians have finally finished building here the southern defense line. Given that most of the forces that the Russians are deploying here are newly mobilized men, it is highly likely that they are deploying them to fill the gaps in the defensive line to protect the region from the possible Ukrainian counteroffensive. In any case, Ukrainian military officials emphasized that so far, Ukrainian forces have not observed a significant enough increase in Russian forces to fear an offensive operation from them. When it comes to the Kherson region here, the Russians have been conducting a series of assaults. The main goal was to return full control over the parts of the right bank of the Dnipro River. Russian small-scale reconnaissance in-force operations have not brought any visible result as the Ukrainians continue to shell Russian prefrontal positions and also send small scout groups across the river. Last time we covered this region, I told you that the Russians discovered that the number of boats on their side of the river was increasing, which clearly indicated that the Ukrainians had crossed the river and were conducting reconnaissance in the deep rear. This might explain a series of very successful precision strikes, because over the last 4 days, the Ukrainians have destroyed 1 ammunition depot in Kharkovka and 1 command center, 1 ammunition depot and 1 base in the Skadovsk region. Finally, when it comes to the Kinburn Peninsula, Ukrainian officials are not clarifying the situation and just saying that the operation is still ongoing. But as someone who lives in this region, I know that people from Kharkiv see a lot of explosions on the Kinburn Peninsula. Judging by the videos, the Ukrainians are incinerating Russian positions there, while the Russians are helplessly resisting. They have no artillery support, no air defense systems, and no value in holding their positions in Ukraine.